مرحبا وأهلا بكم في برنامج داخل واشنطن. معكم مضيفكم روبرت ساتلوف. بعد عامين من مفاجأة انتخاب دونالد ترامب رئيسا التي أذهلت العالم، ستسمح الفرصة للناخبين الأميركيين مرة ثانية للتعبير عن رأيهم في قيادته وسيطرة حزبه الجمهوري على كل من الكونغرس والبيت الأبيض. لمناقشة النتائج المتوقعة للانتخابات في كل من المجلس النواب ومجلس الشيوخ وآثار الانتخابات على النص الثاني من رئاسة ترامب، يسرني أن أرحب بالمعلقين السياسيين البارعين ستيف كليمنز وتوم روغان. Welcome back to Dakhel, Washington. Well, after 2 years of the Trump administration, voters get to express their views the only way that really matters, with their votes. This is our midterm elections, and we are here today to talk about what's coming up. Gentlemen, Tom, Steve, thank you for being here. So, Tom, what's at stake in our midterm vote?
Well, I think the first thing that Republicans would say is at stake is the Trump administration's consolidation of power. Can they produce new legislation? But more than that, can Democrats begin to conduct what they have called a number of different investigations into what they see as potential Trump administration misconduct? So in a sense of President Trump's power as the chief executive, there's a lot at stake in terms of what he might be able to do in the future, but also what pressures he might face from the Democratic opposition. As a secondary point, though, I think in terms of the pathway of the country, there are a lot of deep divergences now in terms of what perhaps a Democratic Congress would offer in terms of an expansion of programs in the area of like healthcare, and a Republican Congress in terms of a momentum behind the scenes but very real to try and take a stab at entitlement reform, even though President Trump has suggested he wouldn't be necessarily amenable to that.
So, Steve, how would you characterize the stakes in this election?
I think the stakes are huge, and I agree with Tom that in part the question for Republicans is whether they can maintain a proactive agenda on things like immigration and redesigning that issue, on trade. When you step back and look at what the president has accomplished in their own mind, tax reform, lowering taxes, at least putting some dents into the Affordable Care Act, otherwise known as Obamacare, basically creating conditions where there's a toxicity about further immigration and redoing all of that. They want to maintain all that and move it further and be able to take that agenda. And I would have to say that even in trade, they would argue that he's been very successful in the countries he's gone to the brink with and gotten renegotiations of deals that some Americans are applauding, and I think many of his base are applauding. So they want to keep that going. If they don't keep it going, then the next 2 years, if they were to lose, say, the House of Representatives, are going to be stuck responding to deep investigative queries on all sorts of fronts. And that robs the president of a proactive agenda, and they spend their time reacting to political conditions that others are setting.
So President Trump is not on the ballot.
No.
This is a midterm election for Congress. Yeah. So my question is, how much of this is a referendum on President Trump?
It's a huge referendum on President Trump, even though he was very creatively said in one moment that forget this is a vote for Congress, this is me, this is Trump. But then just recently he came out and said, if they lose, it's not me, that they lost. So he's playing it both sides. But the fact is that Donald Trump is the most distinctive and important feature of American politics today, to which all parties are responding one way or another. And so no matter what the President of the United States says, this is a referendum on his leadership, his accomplishments, and what people expect down the road.
Do you agree, Tom? Or do Democratic ideas, Republican ideas matter? Or is this
I think
Trump?
on the Democratic side, it very much is the Trump candidacy. I mean, that is the mobilizing force. It has been said that this potentially, if Democrats, when will be the election of suburban women, that they will come out in droves because they detest President Trump. But regardless, the Democratic Party does not like the president far more than they dislike a lot of previous Republican presidents. So there is that galvanizing element to come out and say, Democrats are saying, come out and vote for us and show President Trump that you reject him. On the Republican side, it's a little different. I think in some states, the more conservative-leaning states, certainly President Trump is seen as an asset, and you see this a lot of campaigning from the president. But, and this is where the president doesn't really like necessarily, I think, the truth, there are areas where the president is not as popular. We think about Michigan, for example. The Republican Senate candidate in Michigan has tried to take very obviously a quite un-Trump tone in terms of how he engages with his Democratic opponent, the incumbent senator there, trying to be sort of more polite, more consensual in a way in terms of their interactions on the debate stage. And so there is this sort of, and I think over the longer term, the medium to longer term, that divergence does reflect that the Republican Party, as much as it is happy to drink the enjoyable, sugar-filled excitement of tax reform, etc., and bombastic Trump taking on the world, in the medium to longer term, issues like free trade, issues like dialogue in the country, certainly in the center of the party, they are going to have to be resolved. I don't think Trump, the idea that Trump has taken ownership of the party, yes, he has, but I don't necessarily think for the medium to long term.
So it's been weeks, it seems, which is a lifetime in Washington. It's weeks since we've seen a headline about the Mueller investigation, Paul Manafort, the now convicted former chairman, all that negative stuff about Donald Trump. Is that now removed from the minds of voters?
That is removed until November 7th.
Mm-hmm. The day after the election.
The day after the election, because until then, right now, Donald Trump doesn't want those headlines out there, and the Democrats are not challenging Trump on that front because they know that as they poll their potential voters, they're not interested in Mueller. They're interested in take-home pay, health care, the kind of domestic paycheck issues at home, and on values issues like treatment of women and misogyny that they feel in the White House one way or another. Or maybe some voters very much like Donald Trump's brand of pugnacious nationalism that appeals to them. So that is what's going on. So the Russia investigation, the issues of meddling won't come back. But I tell you, there is one issue, I think right now baked into the system, even though the Republicans, I think, have gained a lot of ground as we approach the election, much more people that thought that it's baked in that the Democrats probably will win the House of Representatives. If they don't win the House, and Republicans, we wake up and the Republicans control the House on November 7th, all eyes will go back to potential meddling in the election system. What were the close races? Was there evidence? Because one of the lurking issues out there that at least the wonks, the policy wonks talk about is what are we doing to prevent Russia or other international parties from meddling in our elections again? And the uniform answer among Republicans and Democrats is not enough. Now that's not high on the agenda, but if there is an election return that's different than where expectations are, that'll definitely be back on the agenda in a big way.
And as an extension to Steve's point, though, I think that actually if the Republicans are to hold Congress on November 7th, you will also see an expectation perhaps that President Trump will put a lot more overt pressure on the Deputy Attorney General Rod Rosenstein to say to Mueller, which we think this week there's been some good reporting suggesting he's already said it to some degree, you better get Mueller to wrap this up, to take a more harsher line. Whereas at the moment you have seen President Trump's advisors being able to persuade him slightly, look, you have the momentum here, just write it out until the election. But a lot at stake is the simple takeaway.
All right, let's take a close look at the election itself. Now, historically, the party that holds the White House loses this first midterm election of a new president. Now, of course, President Trump breaks all the rules, and we should throw out the rule book. Do you think that general trend is still applying, or do we have a whole new, fresh, clean approach toward looking at this election? Steve?
I think the rules of gravity in American politics are very much altered, and it's very dangerous to presume that because something happened in the past that it's likely to happen in the future. Certainly that did happen in the past, but as you said, Donald Trump is a very different character. The way his base is responding and seems to be impervious to any negative reaction from him, so their numbers aren't moving. the intensity of their feeling about supporting Donald Trump has remained rather high, where in past you've seen it really wobble. Remember with the case of George H.W. Bush and Read My Lips, No Doubt. I mean, there are things like that where people lost. Donald Trump's support is solid. And I think that we need to be very careful of making that assumption. And then things like the Supreme Court nomination of Kavanaugh. You and I discussed this in the past. I thought he was the blandest, least interesting choice that would not animate the evangelical values.
You were wrong.
I was wrong, and I will admit it here, I was wrong, because there were parts of his past I knew nothing about. But this proved to be a huge animator of Republican passion, and the enthusiasm gap between Republicans and Democrats for this upcoming election has diminished because it looked like Republicans were apathetic. They're in the game now. So you're right, I was wrong, and it's a very different game. They could hold the House.
And I think also President Trump, one of the things that perhaps doesn't get enough attention, that helps Republicans, that helps, again, President Trump in terms of his ability to set a narrative, is the strength of the economy. Because in a very tangible way, at least at the moment, now deficit, the amount of the gap between revenues and spending is going to be a longer term problem. And President Trump's, I think, policy choices, in a statistical sense, have made that worse. But in the short term, there is a perception by quite a lot of people in the country that things are not that bad for them. That Trump, where some had said Trump was going to come in and blow up the world, well, it hasn't happened yet. It may happen tomorrow.
3.8% unemployment.
Okay, when we come back, we're going to take a much closer look at the House and the Senate and what's going to happen in our midterm elections in just a moment. Again, our panelists include Steve Clemons. Steve is Washington editor-at-large for one of America's premier news, opinion, and literary magazines, The Atlantic, and editor of Atlantic Live. He is also a senior fellow and founder of the American Strategy Program at the New America Foundation, a prominent think tank here in Washington. Sitting to his right is Tom Rogan, an American with a British accent. Tom is host of the McLaughlin Group, a syndicated political television broadcast, and a political columnist for the Washington Examiner. All right, gentlemen, let's take a much closer look at the House of Representatives. What specifically do Democrats need to do to take control of the House?
Well, the Democrats need to win double-digit number of seats, which, again, is something that is harder done than it is said. And the reality is that when you have because of the nature of the House of Representatives, there is a relatively limited pool of seats that are seen as pickable, as winnable for Democrats. So the challenge that they have is to target their resources effectively in those areas where they think they can win. They have a couple of advantages in the sense of some Republican candidates. We think of Duncan Hunter, for example, in California, who have essentially, weakened themselves by their own misconduct or perceived misconduct. But for Democrats, there is a challenge in identifying those right seats. There is also an opportunity, though, that because of again, in sort of more marginal areas, the appeal that, or the lack of appeal, quite frankly, that President Trump has, they can sort of jump on the whipping horse.
Steve, do congressional House elections, do they tend to be determined by local politics or part of a national wave?
Well, in this case, usually, as we were just discussing, in terms of the midterm elections coming and punishing a president who or a party that controls the White House, it's a little bit of both. It's local plus a wave of antipathy or a different direction from the White House. And I agree with what Tom said, but what I would add to it is the Democrats want to win. They seem to be pushing on one button mostly, and that is the views of women. They're running more women than ever for political office. Donald Trump's treatment and posture towards women has been disconcerting to a good number of people. And so their job, as we've seen in two other races, both in Alabama and Virginia, where Democrats won surprising races, was all due to suburban women, but also women of color, turning out at near what we call general election levels. So if you get that kind of wave of electoral participation, when usually voting participation is lower, that then would assure that wave comes in and sweeps across district after district, no matter what is going on locally within the.
The Republican who runs the House of Representatives, the Speaker of the House, the general, if you will, has left the battlefield. Yeah. He's not running for re-election. Does that suggest something about Republican enthusiasm, or whether Republicans feel as though they can keep the House?
Well, you know, I think Paul Ryan, the Speaker, is stepping down because, quite frankly, the Trump brand of conservative politics is not the Ryan brand, and frankly, he doesn't want to deal with the incredible tension that he has in terms of the Republican caucus in the House. But interestingly, again, as a side note to the broader midterm elections that we're about to have, the divergence between the two leading candidates to replace Paul Ryan, if the Republicans are to hold the House, or but frankly, if they are to lose as well, to be the Republican minority leader in the House, there is a big discrepancy. On one hand, you have Jim Jordan, who is a very much Trump-like figure in terms of at least the populist narrative of conservative politics. On the other hand, you have Kevin McCarthy, who is trying to play a little bit to that populist side, but really is more in the brand of the consensual deal-maker, old-school Republican in Congress. And so whatever happens in the midterms, it won't just be about a retained or changed dimension in terms of the standing of Congress. It'll be a catalyst for developments in the Republican Party.
I mean, one sees this also in the Democrats, with tension between the old guard, Nancy Pelosi, and some of these
they could win the House. Nancy Pelosi could be the one that delivers money into the system. She's the best vote counter in the game. But they very well could end up with a sizable majority in the House, and they could topple her because of commitments that candidates have made down the field, because she's so unpopular in some districts. And in the efforts, this is all about the pursuit of independence. It's not even about the pursuit of the left in the party, although that's part of the
independent voters.
Independent voters that they are chasing tend not to like Nancy Pelosi. Some on the far left in the Democratic Party also don't like Nancy Pelosi. So bashing Nancy Pelosi has become somewhat of a successful game plan for some candidates that are running. And there may be so many that win that they actually end up losing that tilt in this. Now, to Nancy's advantage, there isn't anyone else that obviously stands out who has her money raising prowess, who understands across the board district. You know, the one person who could have possibly taken her on and challenged, Joe Crowley, lost in a primary. So she may end up prevailing and winning simply because there's no one else of her standard on the bench.
Is there one House congressional race, before we go to the Senate, is there one House race that our viewers abroad might want to keep their eye on as a bellwether of the contests that we're seeing?
You know, I forget the exact district, but the California, I think maybe 27th, Duncan Hunter, a Republican incumbent, who was looking strong, who has been now indicted by the Justice Department on a range of misconduct charges, corruption charges, faces a young, dynamic, a sort of not a Muslim, but has Arabic ancestry.
He's a Palestinian Hispanic,
exactly.
Amar Kampa Najjar.
A very much, why don't you sort of take
No, I agree with you. Amar Kampa Najjar is someone here. He worked with the U.S. Hispanic Institute here in Washington, D.C., a Obama administration guy. His grandfather or great-grandfather was a Palestinian terrorist, and so they've tried to kind of paint that with him. But, you know, he's grown up, but his family is Hispanic and Palestinian. But you know, bad thing after bad thing after bad thing has happened to Duncan Hunter, and his numbers look horrible. So that's one. I think the other one, if I may add, is down in Florida, and I don't know Florida what, but Donna Shalala running. That was a district that Democrats were probably surely to win. But Donna Shalala, former Secretary of Health and Human Services, former head of the Clinton Foundation, very close to the Clinton family and Clinton clan, is trailing in this. You know, what used to be a Democratic tilting and Democratic likely seat. So that's, again, another bellwether down in Florida. Florida, in general, is always a bellwether, and we're going to see what happens in the governor's race there, what happens with at the Senate level with Bill Nelson. We haven't gotten into the Senate, but there are a number of these Senate races that I think used to be that look solid for the Democrats, and now are very shaky.
So let's move to the Senate. Just to remind our viewers, only 1/3 of the Senate is up for election, and there Republicans have a built-in advantage.
Right.
Isn't that right?
Well, they have a built-in advantage. You would know the exact number, but say we have 33 seats up in the next right, a third of the Senate. I think about 2/3 of those are currently held by Democrats. So you have Democrats in about, what, 22 of the seats or so, and you have 11 that are held by Republicans. That means the challenge, you've got just a lot more Democrats facing the voters right now than you do Republicans. In 2 years, it's exactly the opposite. The Republicans will be the ones that are very much up front. But in that case, we just had, as we were discussing the Kavanaugh hearing, and if you go through and look at North Dakota and Senator Heidi Heitkamp's vote to vote against the Kavanaugh nomination, that has probably put her way under in terms of the enthusiasm, her voters for her candidacy. You have other cases with Claire McCaskill that I think look shaky in Missouri, Bill Nelson in Florida, John Tester in Montana, who also voted against Kavanaugh.
If there's one Senate race our viewers should watch, what would that be, Tom?
Well, I think I'm a little bit of an outlier here, but I think it's very interesting, the Michigan Senate race. I think it is unlikely. I think Senator Debbie Stabenow, who is the Democratic incumbent, is likely to win. But very interesting to see the Republican Senate candidate there, an African-American, former military veteran, business owner, very well-spoken, probably a face that even if he loses, because of how much he has improved in the polls, he would be someone to watch as a potential comeback Republican in the future.
So just before we close, very quick predictions. Who wins the House? Who wins the Senate?
Dems win the House, Republicans maintain the Senate.
I think Republicans hold both chambers.
Okay, so we will have you both back to find out which one of you is wrong again.
Right.
Thank you very much for joining us in Dakhla, Washington.
Thank you.
Chuck Schumer said on the Senate floor, you own the House, you own the Senate, and talking about Republicans, and you own the White House. Why can't you get anything done? It's simple, 60 votes. You need 60 votes in the United States Senate, the legislative filibuster, to get anything done. It's a process that is egregiously flawed, and it means that very good legislation never sees the light of day. You shouldn't need a supermajority to do everyday business.
On Tuesday, tens of millions of Americans will vote in our legislative elections. At stake is control of Congress, with all 435 representatives and 1/3 of the 100 senators to be chosen. I can still remember the first time I voted. The year was 1980. I was a college student in the state of North Carolina, hundreds of miles from my hometown. Like many Americans who can't be at their local polling booth, people who are old and sick, soldiers overseas, students far away, I had arranged to receive my ballot by mail so I could still cast my vote. Nearly 40 years later, I still remember checking off names on the ballot, signing the form, and bringing the large envelope to the post office to make sure it arrived on time to be counted. It was an experience I will never forget. Foreign adversaries of the United States are trying to subvert this sacred process. Russia, China, Iran, perhaps others. Sure, we all spy on each other. Yes, we steal each other's secrets. They do it, America does it too. But to use electronic warfare to hack into the election system and manipulate the voting process is more than just a spy game. It is an attack on our very system of government, an attack on America no less serious than an attack with a missile or a bomb. Now, Democrats and Republicans don't agree on very much these days, but on this issue, we are neither red nor blue. On this issue, we are all Americans, and our adversaries should not forget it. بهذا نصل إلى نهاية هذه الحلقة من برنامج داخل واشنطن. إذا كانت لديكم أي استفسارات أو تعليقات حول هذه الحلقة وخاصة حول العملية الانتخابية في بلادنا، أرجو أن تتواصلوا معي عبر تويتر على هاشتاج Inside Washington أو أن تراسلوني مباشرة على @RobSatloff. سأراكم الأسبوع المقبل وإلى أن ألاقيكم شكرا لكم وإلى اللقاء.